A shocking death rocks a quiet English village. 5 hidden clues could reveal the killer. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. Where are you joining us from today? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Let's begin. Episode 1, The Crime.
Evening all. Fine night, isn't it?
Aye, it is. And how's the family? Very well, thank you. Busy as always.
Good to hear.
The scream came just as the vicar began to pour the tea. For a brief moment, the pleasant murmur of conversation at Rosewood Manor froze into silence. Cups hovered halfway to lips. A spoon clattered onto a saucer. And in that instant, Miss Marple noticed something rather curious. While the others turned toward the sound in alarm, one guest did not look surprised at all. Rosewood Manor stood at the edge of the peaceful village of Little Brackford, surrounded by gentle hills, tidy hedgerows, and the sort of quiet respectability that English villages seem to cultivate like roses. On that particular afternoon, the gardens of the manor were filled with polite society. The annual Little Brackford Charity Garden Tea was a cherished tradition. Tables draped with pale linen dotted the lawn, each decorated with small bowls of roses from the manor's famous gardens. The villagers had gathered in their finest summer attire to support the restoration of St. Michael's church roof. At the center of the event stood the host himself. Arthur Penberry, owner of Rosewood Manor. He was a tall man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a voice that carried comfortably across the lawn. Arthur Penberry had lived in Little Brackford for nearly 20 years and was widely respected as a generous benefactor. Though, as Miss Marple often said, generosity sometimes concealed other motives. Arthur moved among the guests with polished charm, laughing warmly and complimenting the vicar's wife on the lemon cakes. "Splendid turnout this year," he remarked. "Quite splendid," replied Inspector Harold Finch, who had attended the event purely as a guest, not in any official capacity. A large man with thoughtful eyes, Finch had been stationed in the nearby town for several years and was well known to the villagers. Nearby sat Miss Jane Marple, quietly knitting beside a small table of cucumber sandwiches. She had been invited by her friend Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, the manor's housekeeper. Miss Marple had the appearance of someone who might miss very little while appearing to notice almost nothing. Her knitting needles clicked gently. Her eyes moved slowly over the gathering. Little Brackford was, after all, much like St. Mary Mead, and human nature tended to repeat itself with remarkable consistency. Among the guests were several individuals Miss Marple had been discreetly observing. There was Dr. Leonard Hale, the village physician, a serious man with a calm manner who spoke little but watched everything. Close by stood Clara Penberry, Arthur's young second wife. She was elegant and striking, nearly 20 years younger than her husband, and dressed in pale blue silk that fluttered softly in the warm breeze. Clara smiled often, though her eyes occasionally flickered with something sharper. Then there was Jonathan Blake, Arthur Penberry's business partner from London. Blake had arrived only the day before and possessed the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to negotiations rather than village gossip. At the far end of the lawn sat Margaret Dalloway, Arthur's niece. Margaret had been living at Rosewood Manor since the death of her parents several years earlier. She was pale and reserved, with thoughtful dark eyes that followed her uncle carefully. And finally, moving quietly among the tables with a tray of tea, was Thomas Reed, the manor's long-serving gardener. His face was weathered from years outdoors, and though he spoke politely when addressed, he seemed uncomfortable among the elegant guests. Miss Marple noticed that Thomas Reed never came too close to Arthur Penberry. Interesting. As the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere remained cheerful. The vicar gave a short speech about community spirit. Mrs. Whitcomb supervised the serving of cakes with military efficiency. Children chased one another between the rose bushes. And yet, beneath the gentle charm of the occasion, something felt slightly strained. Miss Marple could not have explained it exactly. But there were small signs. Arthur Penberry had argued quietly with Jonathan Blake near the veranda earlier. Miss Marple had not heard the words, but Blake's face had turned an unpleasant shade of red before he forced a smile and walked away. Later, Clara Penberry had been seen speaking urgently to Dr. Hale beside the Rose Arch. And Margaret Dalloway had spent much of the afternoon watching her uncle with what looked suspiciously like resentment. Village gatherings were excellent places for observing human behavior. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their calm rhythm. The moment came shortly after 5 o'clock. The vicar's wife had just poured a fresh pot of tea. Arthur Penberry stood beside the fountain, raising his cup with cheerful ceremony. "To the good people of Little Brackford," he declared. Laughter followed. Cups were lifted. And then the scream shattered the afternoon. It came from inside the house. A young maid burst through the veranda doors, white as chalk. "Mr. Penberry," she gasped. "Sir, please, come quickly." The guests exchanged startled glances. Arthur frowned. "What on earth?" But before he could finish the sentence, a second cry echoed from the house. This one was louder. Panic spread instantly across the lawn. Inspector Finch rose at once. "Everyone stay where you are," he said firmly. "I'll see what's happened." Arthur Penberry followed him through the open doors, several others trailing behind despite the inspector's instructions. Miss Marple did not hurry. She folded her knitting neatly into her bag and rose with quiet interest. In her experience, sudden commotion often revealed the most telling reactions. The drawing room of Rosewood Manor was cool and dim compared with the bright garden outside. Several servants stood gathered near the doorway. And on the polished oak floor, beside the drinks cabinet, Arthur Penberry lay dead. His body had collapsed awkwardly against a small table. A crystal glass lay shattered nearby. Inspector Finch knelt immediately. Dr. Hale stepped forward to examine the body. There was a tense silence. Finally, Dr. Hale looked up. "I'm afraid he's gone," he said quietly. Clara Penberry gave a soft cry. Margaret Dalloway covered her mouth. Jonathan Blake stared at the body with wide, stunned eyes. "Heart attack," someone whispered. Dr. Hale shook his head slowly. "No. I don't believe so." Inspector Finch picked up the broken glass carefully. A faint bitter smell lingered in the air. "Poison," he said grimly. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Poison. In Little Brackford. At a charity tea. Inspector Finch rose and addressed the group firmly. "No one leaves the manor until we understand what's happened." A servant was sent to telephone the police station. The guests were escorted back to the garden. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her eyes thoughtful. Poison, she reflected, was rarely an impulsive crime. It suggested planning, patience, and motive. She glanced toward the drinks cabinet. A tray of glasses still stood there. One was missing. Another detail caught her eye. A faint smear of red rose pollen marked the edge of the cabinet. Miss Marple frowned slightly. That was rather odd. The roses in the garden had been carefully arranged in bowls. Why would pollen be on the drinks cabinet inside the house? Her gaze moved slowly around the room. And then she noticed something else. Thomas Reed, the gardener, stood near the doorway. He looked pale. But he wasn't staring at the body. He was staring at Clara Penberry. And Clara, Miss Marple observed, seemed very carefully avoiding his eyes. Outside, the garden had fallen into anxious whispers. Inspector Finch began questioning the guests. "When did Mr. Penberry last have a drink?" he asked. Margaret spoke first. "He came inside a few minutes before the speech," she said. "I think he said he wanted a sherry." Jonathan Blake nodded. "Yes. I saw him go into the drawing room." Clara Penberry's voice trembled slightly. "I assumed he was fetching another bottle." Inspector Finch looked thoughtful. So the poison must have been placed in his drink while he was alone. Miss Marple, listening quietly nearby, shook her head almost imperceptibly. People, she reflected, often made the mistake of assuming the obvious explanation must be correct. But human beings were rarely so simple. Her eyes drifted toward the house again. Toward the rose bushes near the veranda doors. And suddenly she remembered something. Just 10 minutes earlier, she had seen someone leaving the house. Someone carrying a small garden pruning knife. At the time, it had seemed entirely innocent. But now... Miss Marple folded her hands gently. She turned toward Inspector Finch. "Inspector," she said politely. "Yes, Miss Marple? I wonder if it might interest you to know that shortly before Mr. Penberry's speech." She paused. "I saw someone leaving the drawing room rather quickly." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Who?" Miss Marple looked across the garden. Directly at one of the guests. And at that exact moment, that person realized she had been seen. Their face drained of color. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Why, Inspector?" It was Jonathan Blake. And as the entire garden turned toward him, Jonathan Blake slowly backed away. Then suddenly ran. Episode 2, The First Suspects.
You were near the room earlier, weren't you?
Jonathan Blake ran. The moment Miss Marple calmly spoke his name, the color drained from his face, and before anyone quite understood what was happening, he turned sharply and bolted across the lawn. For several seconds the entire garden froze in stunned disbelief. Then Inspector Finch shouted, "Blake! Stop!" But Jonathan Blake had already reached the iron gate at the edge of the garden path. And that was the moment everyone in Little Brackford realized something far more frightening than a sudden death had occurred. Arthur Penberry's killer might be standing right among them. The quiet charm of the charity tea had vanished entirely. Within half an hour, Rosewood Manor had become the center of a full police investigation. 2 constables arrived from the nearby station, and the gates were closed. No guest was allowed to leave until Inspector Finch had taken statements. Jonathan Blake, however, had not escaped. He had run no more than 200 yards down the lane before colliding with Constable Pritchard, who had been cycling toward the manor after receiving the telephone call. Blake now sat inside the manor's small study, guarded and visibly shaken. Inspector Finch stood before him. "You understand," Finch said calmly, "that running from a murder investigation is an extremely unfortunate decision." Blake wiped sweat from his forehead. "I panicked." "People often do," Finch replied. "Especially when they think they might be blamed." Blake's voice sharpened. "I didn't kill Arthur Penberry." Inspector Finch studied him carefully. "Then perhaps you can explain why Miss Marple saw you leaving the drawing room shortly before Mr. Penberry died." Blake hesitated. Outside the study door, Miss Marple sat quietly in the hallway with Mrs. Whitcomb, knitting once again. She was not technically part of the investigation. But Inspector Finch had already learned that ignoring Miss Marple's observations was rarely wise. Inside the study, Blake finally spoke. "I went inside for a drink," he said. "Arthur and I had been discussing business matters earlier. I needed something stronger than tea." "Did you see Mr. Penberry?" "No." "Did you prepare a drink?" "Yes, a whiskey." "And Mr. Penberry's glass?" Blake shook his head quickly. "I didn't touch it." Inspector Finch watched him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Miss Marple claims you left the room in a hurry." Blake swallowed. "I realized Arthur was coming inside. I thought it might be awkward. We'd had a disagreement earlier." "What sort of disagreement?" Blake hesitated again. Finally he said, "Money." The revelation spread through the manor quickly. Guests whispered among themselves as Inspector Finch continued his interviews. Miss Marple, sitting peacefully near the veranda doors, listened with gentle interest as fragments of conversation drifted through the air. Arthur Penberry, it seemed, had not been quite as financially comfortable as the villagers believed. Jonathan Blake had been his business partner in several London investments. And according to Blake's reluctant statement, those investments had recently begun to fail. Quite badly. He owed me a great deal of money, Blake admitted. How much? Inspector Finch asked. Nearly £40,000. That was enough to make anyone uncomfortable. But perhaps not enough to commit murder. Miss Marple clicked her knitting needles thoughtfully. Money, she knew, was a powerful motive. But it was rarely the only one. The next interview proved even more interesting. Clara Penberry sat in the morning room, her elegant composure somewhat shaken. Inspector Finch spoke gently. Mrs. Penberry, several guests mentioned that you spoke with Dr. Hale earlier this afternoon. Yes, she replied. Was that conversation about your husband? For the briefest moment, Clara hesitated. Miss Marple, observing quietly through the open door, noticed. Yes, Clara said finally. Arthur had not been feeling well lately. I asked Dr. Hale if he might examine him. Dr. Hale himself confirmed the conversation. But his tone was cautious. Mr. Penberry had complained of fatigue, the doctor explained. Nothing serious. Did you prescribe any medication? No. Inspector Finch leaned back slightly. You're certain of that? Quite certain. Miss Marple watched both of them closely. Clara Penberry's hands were clasped very tightly in her lap. And Dr. Hale, though calm, seemed unusually careful with his words. Curious. Meanwhile, Margaret Dalloway proved far less composed. When Inspector Finch asked about her relationship with her uncle, her voice trembled. We weren't close. Why not? Margaret hesitated. Then she said quietly. Because my uncle controlled everything. What do you mean? My inheritance, she replied. My life. He insisted I remain here at the manor rather than marry. Inspector Finch raised an eyebrow. Was there someone you wished to marry? Margaret looked away. Yes. And Mr. Penberry refused permission? He threatened to cut me out of his will. Inspector Finch made a note. Another motive. Miss Marple's knitting paused briefly. Human relationships, she reflected, often produced the strongest reasons for murder. By early evening, the atmosphere inside Rosewood Manor had grown heavy with suspicion. Inspector Finch gathered the primary suspects in the drawing room. Jonathan Blake. Clara Penberry. Dr. Leonard Hale. Margaret Dalloway. And Thomas Reed, the gardener. Each had been near the house shortly before Arthur Penberry died. Each had some connection, or tension, with the victim. But something still did not fit. Miss Marple's mind kept returning to the small details she had noticed earlier. The rose pollen. The broken glass. And Thomas Reed's strange reaction when he looked at Clara Penberry. She rose quietly and wandered toward the veranda doors. The evening air carried the soft scent of roses. Thomas Reed was standing near the garden path, staring down at the flower beds. Miss Marple approached him gently. Such beautiful roses, she remarked. Thomas nodded stiffly. Yes, miss. You've tended them for many years, I imagine. 15. Then you must know them very well. Thomas glanced at her uncertainly. Yes. Miss Marple smiled kindly. I noticed something interesting earlier today. Thomas stiffened. Oh? Yes. A smear of rose pollen inside the drawing room. The gardener's face paled slightly. Miss Marple continued softly. That struck me as rather odd. Thomas swallowed. I wouldn't know anything about that. Of course not. Miss Marple paused. But I also noticed you watching Mrs. Penberry. At that, Thomas looked sharply toward the house. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You seemed quite upset. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, very quietly, he muttered. You don't know what goes on in that house. Miss Marple tilted her head. Perhaps not. Thomas leaned closer, lowering his voice. But if you want the truth. He stopped suddenly. Someone had stepped onto the veranda behind them. Clara Penberry. She looked directly at Thomas. And her expression was not friendly. Thomas straightened immediately. Evening, ma'am. Clara said nothing. But the look she gave him was enough. Thomas turned and walked quickly down the garden path. Miss Marple watched him go. Then she looked back at Clara. Clara smiled politely. Such dreadful business, Miss Marple. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Dreadful indeed. Later that night, Inspector Finch reviewed the statements in the Manor Library. Miss Marple sat opposite him. You have several suspects, she said gently. Too many, Finch replied. Blake had financial motive. Margaret had inheritance motive. Clara's behavior was uncertain. And Dr. Hale had been alone with Arthur earlier that week during a house visit. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, but motives are rarely as simple as they appear. Finch sighed. And what do you think? Miss Marple folded her hands. I think someone in this house is hiding something very important. Who? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked. Inspector, has anyone examined Mr. Penberry's study? Not yet. Perhaps you should. Finch frowned. Why? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Because people who keep secrets often leave them written down. 10 minutes later, Inspector Finch unlocked the study door. The room was quiet. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows. Finch began searching the desk drawers carefully. Most contained ordinary papers. Bills. Letters. Business documents. Then he opened the bottom drawer. Inside lay a leather folder. Finch opened it. And immediately sat upright. Inside the folder were several handwritten letters. Each addressed to Arthur Penberry. Each demanding money. And each signed with the same name. Thomas Reed. Inspector Finch stared at the letters in disbelief. At that exact moment, Miss Marple appeared quietly in the doorway. Inspector, she said softly. You found them, haven't you? Finch held up the letters. These are blackmail notes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes. Finch's voice hardened. And they're written by the gardener. Miss Marple's expression became thoughtful. Yes, they appear to be. Inspector Finch closed the folder. Well then, he said grimly. I believe we've just found our murderer. But Miss Marple did not look convinced. Instead, she gazed thoughtfully at one of the letters. And murmured almost to herself. How very strange. Because something about the handwriting felt terribly familiar. And at that moment, Miss Marple realized something deeply unsettling. She had seen writing exactly like it before. Very recently. Inside the manor. But not from Thomas Reed. From someone else entirely.
People reveal much when they think no one is watching.
Episode 3, Hidden Secrets.
The past has a way of returning.
The letters looked damning. Spread across the desk in Arthur Penberry's study, the blackmail notes seemed to point directly at the gardener, Thomas Reed. Each letter demanded money. Each hinted darkly at a secret from the past. And each bore the same uneven, slightly slanted handwriting. Inspector Finch tapped one of the pages thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "it appears Mr. Reed had a rather compelling reason to see Mr. Penberry dead." Miss Marple did not immediately respond. Instead, she leaned slightly closer to the desk lamp and studied the handwriting again. Her gentle eyes narrowed. "Inspector," she said slowly, "have you noticed something rather curious about these letters?" Finch glanced at them again. "They're blackmail demands." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But they're also rather theatrical." "Theatrical?" "Yes. The wording is quite dramatic. Your shame will be exposed, the truth will destroy you, and so on." Finch shrugged. "Blackmailers often enjoy a bit of drama." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Indeed they do. But this particular style feels familiar." She said nothing more. But inside her mind, something had begun to stir. Thomas Reed was brought into the study shortly afterward. The gardener looked nervous, though he tried to maintain a calm expression. Inspector Finch placed the letters in front of him. "Do you recognize these?" Thomas glanced down. For a moment his face went completely blank. Then he shook his head firmly. "No, sir. They were found in Mr. Penberry's desk. I've never written those." Inspector Finch folded his arms. "They're signed with your name." "That doesn't make them mine," Thomas replied quickly. His voice was tense now. "Someone's trying to frame me." Finch leaned closer. "And why would anyone want to do that?" Thomas hesitated. Miss Marple watched him carefully. People under pressure often revealed more than they intended. Finally Thomas said quietly. "Because I knew something about Mr. Penberry." Inspector Finch's eyes sharpened. "What sort of thing?" Thomas glanced toward the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Years ago," he said slowly, "before he came to Little Brackford, Mr. Penberry was involved in a terrible scandal." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Go on." Thomas swallowed. "There was a business partner in London. A man named Edward Grant." Inspector Finch frowned. "And?" "He died." The room went very still. "How?" Finch asked. Thomas hesitated. "They said it was suicide." "But you don't believe that?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir." Miss Marple's knitting needles, resting in her lap, clicked softly. "Why not?" she asked. Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Because I used to work for Mr. Grant." Inspector Finch straightened. "You worked for the man who died?" "Yes." "And you later came to work for Mr. Penberry?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I recognized him the moment he moved to Little Brackford." Finch's voice hardened. "So you blackmailed him?" "I didn't." Thomas insisted. "I swear it." Miss Marple studied him closely. And she believed him. Later that evening, Inspector Finch walked with Miss Marple through the manor garden. The moonlight shimmered faintly across the rose beds. "You think he's telling the truth?" Finch said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. But the letters may not have been written by him at all." Finch sighed. "That seems unlikely." Miss Marple stopped beside the fountain. "Inspector, have you ever noticed how often people underestimate the power of imitation?" Finch frowned. "Imitation?" "Yes. Handwriting, for example, is not nearly as unique as most people imagine." Finch considered this. "So you believe someone forged the letters?" "Possibly." "And planted them in Penberry's desk?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, though that raises a rather interesting question." "Which is?" Who would benefit from making Thomas Reed look guilty? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, might lie in the past. The next morning, Inspector Finch arranged for a quiet search of Arthur Penberry's private papers. Miss Marple sat nearby while the inspector examined files and ledgers. Finally Finch discovered something interesting. A thick envelope hidden inside a locked drawer. He opened it carefully. Inside were several old newspaper clippings. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The headlines were unmistakable. London businessman found dead. Police investigate financial scandal. Mystery surrounds death of Edward Grant. Inspector Finch read quickly. Grant's company collapsed, he murmured. Investors lost thousands. Miss Marple pointed to a paragraph halfway down the article. Read that part. Finch did. His business associate, Arthur Penberry, denied involvement in the financial irregularities. He looked up slowly. Good heavens. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Inspector Finch turned the page. Another article. This one included a photograph. Two men stood outside a London office building. One was clearly Arthur Penberry. The other man stood beside him, younger but unmistakably recognizable. Inspector Finch stared at the photograph. Miss Marple. Yes? That's Jonathan Blake. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes. I thought you might notice. The significance of the discovery was immediately clear. Jonathan Blake had not merely been Arthur Penberry's business partner in recent years. He had been involved in the original scandal decades earlier. The scandal connected to Edward Grant's death. Inspector Finch leaned back in his chair. So Blake had a very strong reason to silence Penberry. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, though I suspect the situation may be slightly more complicated. How so? Well, she said gently, Mr. Blake appeared genuinely surprised when the body was discovered. Finch frowned. He also ran away. Quite true. Miss Marple resumed knitting. But people sometimes run when they fear suspicion, not necessarily guilt. Inspector Finch sighed. You're suggesting there's another layer to this. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. There almost always is. That afternoon brought another revelation. Margaret Dalloway requested to speak privately with Inspector Finch. She seemed pale but determined. There's something you should know, she said. Finch listened carefully. It's about my uncle's will. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Oh. Margaret clasped her hands nervously. My uncle changed it last week. Changed it how? Finch asked. Margaret swallowed. He removed me entirely. The inspector blinked. You're certain? Yes. And who inherits the estate now? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Clara. The news spread quickly through the manor. Clara Penberry, it seemed, had become the sole heir to Arthur Penberry's considerable fortune. Inspector Finch immediately questioned her. Clara remained calm. Yes, she admitted. Arthur updated the will recently. Did Margaret know? I believe he planned to tell her soon. Miss Marple watched Clara carefully. The young widow's composure was impressive. Almost too impressive. Finch asked quietly. Did you encourage Mr. Penberry to change the will? Clara's smile was faint. Inspector, surely you're not suggesting. I'm suggesting nothing, Finch said evenly. But it does provide a motive. Clara's eyes hardened slightly. Arthur loved me. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Love, she thought privately, had been known to motivate many crimes. That evening, Miss Marple wandered into the small writing room near the library. She was looking for something quite specific. The desk contained stationery used by guests. Ink. Pens. and several sheets of practice writing paper. Miss Marple examined them carefully. Then she smiled. Because she had found what she suspected. A crumpled sheet in the wastebasket. Covered in repeated words. Thomas Reed. Written over and over again. Practicing the signature. Miss Marple folded the paper quietly. So someone had indeed forged the letters. But why? Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Miss Marple stepped out just as Inspector Finch approached. "I've just received the coroner's preliminary report," Finch said. "Oh? Yes. The poison used was aconite." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Monkshood." Finch looked surprised. "You know it?" "Many gardeners do." Finch's eyes narrowed. "Which brings us back to Thomas Reed." Miss Marple said nothing. Instead she handed Finch the crumpled practice sheet. The inspector read it. Then looked up sharply. "Someone practiced forging Reed's name." "Yes." Finch's voice grew quiet. "So someone deliberately framed the gardener." Miss Marple nodded. "But that's not the most interesting part." "What is?" Miss Marple pointed gently at the handwriting. "Look carefully." Inspector Finch stared at it. Then his eyes widened. Good heavens! Because the handwriting on the practice sheet matched something else perfectly. A note written earlier that week. A note found in Arthur Penberry's personal diary. Written by only one person in the house. Clara Penberry. And as the truth began to shift beneath them, Inspector Finch realized something chilling. The investigation had been heading in the wrong direction all along. But before he could speak, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Followed by a terrified scream. Someone else inside Rosewood Manor had just discovered something. Something hidden. Something that could change everything.
This story didn't end years ago, did it?
Episode 4, The Twist.
Something's missing.
The scream came from the upstairs corridor. It echoed through Rosewood Manor with such sharp panic that even Inspector Finch, who prided himself on calm efficiency, reacted instantly. "What now?" he muttered. Another crash followed, the sound of something heavy falling. Miss Marple, standing beside him in the hallway, simply adjusted her shawl. "Perhaps we should go and see," she said quietly. By the time they reached the staircase, several servants had already gathered below, whispering nervously. At the top of the stairs stood Margaret Dalloway. She looked pale and shaken. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "it's in the guest bedroom." "What is?" Margaret pointed down the corridor. I opened the wardrobe." Inspector Finch hurried forward. Miss Marple followed at her usual unhurried pace. The door to the guest bedroom stood open. Inside, a chair had been knocked over. And on the floor, beside the wardrobe, lay a small wooden box. Its lid hung open. Inspector Finch crouched beside it. Inside were several glass bottles, neatly arranged in velvet slots. Medicine bottles. But Miss Marple immediately noticed something odd. One of the slots was empty. Dr. Hale, who had followed them upstairs, leaned forward to examine the labels. His expression changed instantly. Good heavens! Finch looked up. "What is it?" Dr. Hale pointed at one of the bottles. Aconite tincture. The same poison used to kill Arthur Penberry. Finch frowned. "Are you telling me someone keeps poison in the guest room wardrobe?" Dr. Hale shook his head slowly. "No." Then he looked directly at Margaret. "This is my medical case." The room fell silent. Inspector Finch straightened slowly. "Your case?" "Yes." Dr. Hale's voice was tense now. I brought it when I visited Mr. Penberry earlier this week. I left it in the guest room after examining him. And the aconite? It's a medical preparation. Very small quantities can be used for certain treatments. Finch's gaze sharpened. But it's also deadly. Yes. Finch gestured toward the empty slot. And now the bottle is missing. Dr. Hale nodded grimly. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the window, folded her hands. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Within minutes the entire household had gathered in the upstairs hallway. Clara Penberry stood near the bedroom door, her expression carefully controlled. Jonathan Blake leaned against the wall, arms folded. Thomas Reed lingered at the far end of the corridor. Inspector Finch addressed them all. It appears someone took a bottle of aconite from Dr. Hale's medical case. Jonathan Blake scoffed quietly. Well, that narrows things down, doesn't it? How so? Finch asked. Blake gestured toward the doctor. Seems obvious who had access to it. Dr. Hale stiffened. That's ridiculous. Blake shrugged. You're the one who brought the poison into the house. Inspector Finch raised a hand. That will do, Mr. Blake. Miss Marple watched the exchange with interest. Blake's accusation had come very quickly. Perhaps too quickly. Inspector Finch turned back to Dr. Hale. When was the last time you saw the aconite bottle? 3 days ago. And who knew your case was here? The doctor hesitated. Mrs. Penberry did. All eyes turned toward Clara. She lifted her chin slightly. Arthur asked Dr. Hale to examine him in the guest room, she said calmly. Naturally I knew where the case was. Inspector Finch made a note. And did anyone else know? Clara shrugged faintly. I imagine the servants did. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her bag. But she said nothing. The investigation had taken a new direction. The poison had come from inside the house. And several people had access to it. Later that evening, Inspector Finch sat with Miss Marple in the library once again. This complicates matters, he admitted. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, it does. Dr. Hale had the poison. Indeed. Clara knew where it was. Yes. And Thomas Reed, as gardener, would certainly know about poisonous plants. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, though gardeners tend to prefer natural sources rather than medical tinctures. Finch sighed. Everyone here seems capable of committing the crime. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Inspector, may I ask you something? Of course. When Mr. Penberry went into the drawing room yesterday, did anyone actually see him pour his drink? Finch frowned. No. And did anyone see him drink it? Finch thought for a moment. No. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. Curious. Why? Because everyone assumes the poison was placed in his glass. Finch blinked. Well, wasn't it? Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. That is what everyone believes. Meanwhile, downstairs in the kitchen corridor, Thomas Reed was speaking urgently with Margaret Dalloway. I didn't take that bottle, he whispered. Margaret looked frightened. I believe you. Thomas glanced toward the staircase. You don't understand. If they pin this on me, then tell them the truth, Margaret said. Thomas hesitated. I can't. Why not? He leaned closer. Because the truth would destroy someone. Margaret stared at him. Who? But Thomas shook his head. I've said too much already. At that moment Clara Penberry appeared in the corridor. She paused when she saw them. Margaret, she said coolly, Inspector Finch is looking for you. Margaret nodded quickly and walked away. Clara remained where she was. Watching Thomas. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "You should be careful what you say." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of you." Clara smiled faintly. "You should be." Later that night, Miss Marple wandered through the manor garden. The roses glowed softly under the moonlight. Inspector Finch joined her a moment later. "You seem thoughtful," he said. "I am." "About the poison?" "Partly." Finch folded his arms. "You mentioned earlier that everyone assumes the poison was placed in Penberry's drink." "Yes." "You think that assumption is wrong?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Inspector, may I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Did anyone taste the sherry in the decanter after Mr. Penberry died?" Finch frowned. "No." Miss Marple nodded. "That is what I thought." Finch stared at her. "You think the poison was in the decanter?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she said, "I think someone wanted us to focus very carefully on the glass." Finch's eyes widened slowly. Good heavens! If the poison had been in the decanter instead of the glass, then anyone who drank from it could have died. Which meant the killer had been willing to risk multiple victims. Or... Finch looked at Miss Marple sharply. Unless the killer knew exactly who would drink it. Miss Marple's smile was small but meaningful. Precisely. The next morning brought yet another development. Inspector Finch ordered the drawing room searched again. Constable Pritchard examined the drinks cabinet carefully. A few minutes later he called out, "Inspector." Finch hurried over. "What is it?" Pritchard held up a small object. A folded piece of paper that had been tucked behind the decanter tray. Finch opened it. His eyes widened instantly. It was a note. Written in a familiar elegant script. Miss Marple leaned closer. The message was short. "Meet me in the drawing room at 5. We must settle this once and for all. Clara." Inspector Finch looked up slowly. Mrs. Penberry arranged a private meeting with her husband. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes." Finch frowned. "But the handwriting." Miss Marple studied it carefully. Then she said quietly, "That is not the most important part." "Then what is?" Miss Marple pointed gently at the bottom corner of the note, where a faint smudge of red rose pollen marked the paper. Finch blinked. "The same pollen you noticed yesterday?" "Yes." Miss Marple's voice grew thoughtful. "And that means something very curious." "What?" Miss Marple looked toward the garden, where the rose bushes grew beside the veranda. "Someone carried this note through the garden before placing it behind the drinks tray." Inspector Finch nodded slowly. "That seems likely." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "But the most interesting question is this." She held up the note again. "If Clara wrote this message, why was she already inside the drawing room when the scream occurred?" Finch stared at her. "You're saying she couldn't have delivered the note herself?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly." The inspector's expression darkened. "Then someone else delivered it?" "Yes." "And that person had rose pollen on them." Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "Which brings us back to someone who spends a great deal of time among roses." Inspector Finch's eyes widened. "The gardener." Miss Marple said nothing. But her gaze drifted slowly toward the far end of the garden path, where Thomas Reed stood in the morning sunlight. And at that exact moment, a constable came running from the house. "Inspector." Finch turned. "What is it now?" The constable was pale. "We've just opened Mr. Penberry's safe." "And?" The constable swallowed. "Sir, you'd better come and see this." Minutes later they stood inside the study. The safe door hung open. Inside were several documents. And one large sealed envelope. Inspector Finch broke the seal. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. Then he froze. Miss Marple stepped closer. "What is it?" Finch handed her the document. It was Arthur Penberry's new will. Signed only 2 days before his death. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the final line. Then her eyes widened slightly. Because the will did not leave the estate to Clara. Nor to Margaret. Nor to anyone in the house. Instead, Arthur Penberry had left everything to a name no one expected. A name that changed the entire case. The heir to Rosewood Manor was Thomas Reed.
Now this is interesting.
Episode 5, Miss Marple's Trap.
Let us discuss yesterday.
When Inspector Finch read the name in Arthur Penberry's will, the room fell into a silence so complete that even the ticking clock on the study wall sounded unnaturally loud. The heir to Rosewood Manor was not Clara Penberry. Nor Margaret Dalloway. Nor any distant relative. It was Thomas Reed. The gardener. Inspector Finch slowly lowered the document. "Well," he said grimly, "that changes things." Miss Marple did not immediately speak. She stood very still, her gentle eyes resting thoughtfully on the paper. Then she folded her hands. "Yes," she murmured. "It does. Because if Thomas Reed inherited the entire estate, the obvious conclusion was almost unavoidable. He had a powerful motive for murder. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the obvious explanation was rarely the correct one. The news spread quickly through Rosewood Manor. Thomas Reed was brought into the study once again. This time he looked even more stunned than the others. Inspector Finch placed the will on the desk. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, "did you know that Arthur Penberry changed his will 2 days ago?" Thomas stared at the document. "No, sir." "You're certain?" "Yes." Finch pushed the paper toward him. "Because according to this, you inherit the entire estate." Thomas blinked as if he had not heard correctly. "The estate?" "Yes." Thomas shook his head slowly. "That must be some mistake." Inspector Finch watched him carefully. "Why would it be a mistake?" Thomas hesitated. Then he said something that startled everyone in the room. "Because Mr. Penberry wasn't my enemy." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Oh?" Thomas took a deep breath. "He was my father." The confession sent a ripple of shock through the study. Inspector Finch leaned forward. "Your father?" Thomas nodded. "My mother worked for him many years ago in London. When the scandal with Edward Grant happened, she lost everything." Miss Marple listened quietly. Thomas continued. "She died when I was young. But before she died, she told me the truth." "And you came to work for Penberry?" Finch asked. "Yes." "Why?" Thomas's voice grew tight. "I wanted him to acknowledge me." The room remained silent. Finally Thomas said quietly. "He refused for years. But recently, he changed his mind." Inspector Finch glanced at the will. "And this was his way of making amends?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple's knitting needles rested motionless in her lap. The story rang true. But it also created a curious new problem. If Thomas Reed had finally received recognition from his father, why would he kill him now? Inspector Finch seemed to be thinking the same thing. "You realize," he said carefully, "that this inheritance still gives you a motive." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I didn't poison him." Miss Marple believed him. And that belief was beginning to shape a rather interesting theory. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple suggested something to Inspector Finch. "I wonder," she said gently, if it might be useful to gather everyone together this evening. For what purpose? For tea. Finch blinked. Tea? Yes. Miss Marple smiled politely. In my experience, Inspector, people often reveal the most interesting things when they believe a matter is nearly finished. Finch studied her thoughtfully. You're planning something. Oh no, Miss Marple said innocently. Just a small conversation. The gathering took place in the drawing room, the same room where Arthur Penberry had died. The drinks cabinet stood exactly as it had the previous day. The decanter of sherry had been left untouched for examination. One by one, the suspects took their seats. Clara Penberry sat elegantly near the fireplace. Jonathan Blake lounged beside the window. Dr. Hale occupied a chair near the bookcase. Margaret Dalloway sat quietly near the door. And Thomas Reed stood awkwardly near the veranda. Inspector Finch remained standing beside the cabinet. Miss Marple poured tea calmly. For several minutes they spoke about ordinary matters. The weather. The garden. The unpleasantness of the situation. Then Miss Marple set down her cup. I have always found village life quite fascinating, she said pleasantly. No one responded. She continued. Because people often assume that secrets can remain hidden forever. Jonathan Blake shifted slightly. Miss Marple's eyes moved gently from one face to another. But secrets have a curious habit of revealing themselves through the smallest details. Inspector Finch folded his arms. And which details are those, Miss Marple? Oh, little things. She smiled faintly. For example, the rose pollen. Clara Penberry's eyes flickered. Or the forged letters. Jonathan Blake stiffened. Miss Marple continued calmly. And of course the poison. Dr. Hale cleared his throat. Yes, unfortunate business. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Indeed. She paused. And then there is the matter of the decanter. Inspector Finch looked toward it. You believe the poison was placed there? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Jonathan Blake spoke sharply. That would make the crime extremely risky. Miss Marple smiled. Unless the murderer knew exactly who would drink the sherry. Silence filled the room. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked toward the drinks cabinet. Her voice remained gentle. You see, Arthur Penberry had a very particular habit. She turned toward the group. He always poured his own sherry before making a speech. Margaret nodded faintly. That's true. Miss Marple continued. And yesterday was no different. She pointed to the decanter. But the poison was not inside this bottle. Inspector Finch frowned. Not in the decanter? Miss Marple shook her head. No. She picked up one of the unused glasses from the tray. It was on the rim of the glass. The room went completely still. Miss Marple placed the glass back down carefully. Aconite is absorbed quickly through the mouth. A small smear would be enough. Inspector Finch's eyes widened. Good heavens. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. The poison was applied to the glass Arthur Penberry would choose. Jonathan Blake spoke slowly. But how would the killer know which glass he'd pick? Miss Marple turned toward him. Because the killer handed it to him. The implication spread through the room like a cold wind. Inspector Finch looked at each suspect in turn. Someone here served Mr. Penberry his drink. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. She walked slowly back toward her chair. And that brings us to the most interesting clue of all. Everyone waited. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. The note asking Arthur to meet someone in this room. Inspector Finch glanced at Clara. You mean the note signed by Mrs. Penberry? Yes, Miss Marple said. But Clara Penberry did not write that note. Clara's head snapped up. What? Miss Marple smiled gently. The handwriting was forged. Jonathan Blake shifted uneasily. Miss Marple continued. And the forger practiced writing Thomas Reed's name as well. Inspector Finch's gaze moved slowly around the room. So someone tried to frame the gardener. Miss Marple nodded. And also tried to implicate Mrs. Penberry. The silence deepened. Miss Marple's voice became very soft. Which suggests the murderer wanted suspicion to fall everywhere except on themselves. Inspector Finch said quietly. Do you know who it is? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she looked thoughtfully at one person in the room. And suddenly she noticed something. A tiny reaction. A flicker of fear. The same expression she had seen the moment Arthur Penberry's body was discovered. Miss Marple's eyes widened very slightly. And at that exact moment she understood everything. The poison. The forged letters. The inheritance. The scandal from the past. All of it. Miss Marple looked at Inspector Finch. Her voice was calm. Inspector. Yes? Miss Marple smiled gently. I believe I now know who murdered Arthur Penberry. And across the room. The killer realized she had just been discovered.
Ah, I see.
Episode 6, The Final Revelation.
The truth is simpler than it appears.
The moment Miss Marple said she knew the murderer, the atmosphere in the drawing room changed completely. No one moved. No one spoke. The quiet ticking of the clock above the mantel seemed suddenly very loud. Inspector Finch studied Miss Marple carefully. You're certain? Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, Inspector. Quite certain. Across the room, the suspects watched her with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. Clara Penberry sat very still, her elegant hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jonathan Blake's face had grown pale. Dr. Hale looked thoughtful. Margaret Dalloway seemed almost frightened. And Thomas Reed stood near the veranda doors, rigid with tension. Miss Marple settled comfortably into her chair. My dear Inspector, she said pleasantly, in village life one quickly learns that people are creatures of habit. They repeat patterns. They reveal themselves through the smallest gestures. Inspector Finch nodded slowly. And Arthur Penberry's death revealed several such patterns. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes. 5 particularly important clues. She glanced around the room. 5 clues that, when placed together, tell the entire story. Clue number 1, the rose pollen. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the drinks cabinet. When Mr. Penberry's body was discovered, I noticed a smear of red rose pollen on the cabinet. She looked at Thomas Reed. Now, Mr. Reed naturally works among roses every day. But that is precisely why the clue is interesting. Thomas frowned slightly. Miss Marple continued. A careful gardener brushes such things away automatically. Pollen on furniture would be unusual for him. Inspector Finch nodded thoughtfully. So the pollen came from someone else who had just walked through the garden. Exactly. Miss Marple turned toward the veranda doors. The killer had come in from the rose beds shortly before the poison was administered. Her eyes moved slowly across the group, stopping briefly on one face. Clue number 2, the forged letters. Miss Marple continued calmly. Next we discovered the blackmail letters supposedly written by Thomas Reed. She smiled faintly. But the letters were theatrical. Dramatic. Almost literary. Jonathan Blake shifted in his chair. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on him. And someone had practiced forging Mr. Reed's signature on scrap paper. Inspector Finch nodded. Yes. That suggested someone was deliberately framing him. Indeed, Miss Marple said. But the handwriting itself gave something away. She paused. It matched the writing style used in Arthur Penberry's business correspondence. Finch frowned. Meaning? Miss Marple turned slowly toward Jonathan Blake. Meaning the writer had spent many years working with Arthur Penberry's letters and documents. Blake's expression tightened slightly. Clue number 3, the poison. Miss Marple continued softly. Everyone assumed the poison had been placed inside Mr. Penberry's drink. Inspector Finch nodded. But you proved otherwise. Yes, Miss Marple said. The poison was placed on the rim of a glass. She gestured toward the tray. And that meant the killer had to hand that glass directly to Mr. Penberry. Dr. Hale leaned forward. So the murderer was standing very close to him. Precisely. Miss Marple's gaze drifted slowly across the room again. Someone he trusted. Clue number 4, the false note. Miss Marple picked up the folded note that had been found behind the drinks tray. This note appeared to be written by Clara Penberry. Clara looked sharply at her. But it was not. Miss Marple smiled kindly. The handwriting was again a clever imitation. Inspector Finch nodded. The same person who forged the blackmail letters. Miss Marple continued. The purpose of the note was simple. To suggest Clara had arranged a secret meeting with her husband. Clara's eyes flashed. So suspicion would fall on me. Exactly, Miss Marple said gently. And also on Thomas Reed. Margaret Dalloway whispered. But why? Miss Marple's voice softened. Because both of them were about to benefit from Arthur Penberry's new will. Clue number 5, the inheritance. Miss Marple looked toward Thomas Reed. The discovery of the will seemed to provide the final motive. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. But it actually revealed something far more interesting. Inspector Finch nodded slowly. You mean the timing? Yes. Miss Marple turned toward Jonathan Blake again. You see, Mr. Blake had been Arthur Penberry's business partner for many years. Blake forced a thin smile. That's hardly a crime. No, Miss Marple agreed. But the old London scandal involving Edward Grant was quite serious. Blake's smile vanished. Miss Marple continued calmly. Grant's death left Arthur Penberry in possession of their entire business. Inspector Finch added quietly. And you were there as well, Mr. Blake. Blake said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. For years you helped Mr. Penberry maintain the appearance of respectability. But recently things began to change. She glanced at the will. Mr. Penberry intended to acknowledge Thomas Reed as his son. Thomas lowered his eyes. Miss Marple continued. And that meant revealing the truth about his past. Inspector Finch finished the thought. Which would expose the old scandal. Miss Marple nodded. And possibly reveal that Edward Grant's death was not suicide at all. A heavy silence filled the room. Jonathan Blake's face had gone completely white. Miss Marple looked at him quietly. You see, Mr. Blake. Arthur Penberry had decided to confess everything. Blake's voice came out hoarse. That's ridiculous. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No. He wrote several letters this week. Letters that would have destroyed your reputation. Inspector Finch stepped forward. And possibly reopened the investigation into Grant's death. Blake's hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple continued softly. You tried to stop him. Blake said nothing. Miss Marple's voice grew very calm. So you poisoned him. The accusation hung in the air. Jonathan Blake slowly rose to his feet. You have no proof. Inspector Finch spoke quietly. Actually, we do. He placed a small envelope on the table. Your fingerprints were found on the rim of the glass. Blake stared at it. Then his shoulders sagged. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he laughed bitterly. It was supposed to be simple. Miss Marple watched him kindly. Yes. Most murderers believe it will be. Blake rubbed his face tiredly. Arthur was going to ruin everything. 40 years of careful work, gone. So you killed him, Finch said. Blake nodded slowly. I put the poison on the glass while everyone was outside. And the forged letters? Finch asked. To frame the gardener. And the note? To implicate Clara. Blake gave a hollow smile. I thought I'd covered everything. Miss Marple tilted her head gently. You almost did. Blake looked at her. What gave me away? Miss Marple smiled softly. When Mr. Penberry died, everyone else was shocked. She paused. But you looked afraid. Blake stared at her. Miss Marple continued. Not afraid of death. She folded her hands. Afraid that your secret had finally caught up with you. Constable Pritchard stepped forward and placed Blake under arrest. The room remained silent as he was led away. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the rose garden. Later that evening, Inspector Finch walked with Miss Marple beside the fountain. Well, he said, little Brackford will be talking about this for years. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes. Villages always do. Finch smiled. You solved the entire case with nothing more than observation. Miss Marple chuckled softly. My dear Inspector, human nature rarely changes. She glanced toward the rose bushes. People imagine their secrets are complicated. She paused. But the truth is usually quite simple. Inspector Finch looked toward the quiet manor house. And what will happen to Thomas Reed? Miss Marple smiled gently. I imagine he will inherit Rosewood Manor. Finch nodded. That should make for an interesting future. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yes. She picked a small rose from the bush beside her. And perhaps a more honest one. The village of Little Brackford slowly returned to its peaceful routines. But Miss Marple knew something most villagers preferred not to think about. Behind every polite smile, there was always a secret waiting to bloom.
Human nature rarely changes.